Oi, what's the best game where you get to eat pie? What's the best game where you play a dead guy? You'll find out in VG247's podcast. Here, what's the best game where you swing from a rope? And what's the best game where you batter the Pope? Like I said, you will find out in this here podcast. Right, okay. Hello and welcome to VG247's Best Games Ever podcast, where we attempt to find the best game within an arbitrary category that we've made up. For example, this week we're looking for the best game that completely flopped. In this industry, as with all industries, being brilliant, being the best, being beloved, being gifted with award-winning acclaim doesn't guarantee success. Isn't that right, Tom?
It's a bit of a sore subject, isn't it?
I'm joined, of course, by Tom, Alex, and Dom today. Dom, is this your third time on the podcast?
This is my third time on the podcast, yep.
Yeah, third time on the podcast, and you've won every time you've appeared up until now.
Yeah, unbroken streak.
I mean, I'm not saying you're not going to win, but yeah, I mean, is this going to be like, you're like, at this stage, you're like The Undertaker at WrestleMania, right? And Alex might be Brock Lesnar, or Tom might be Brock Lesnar. It depends. That's right. That's enough wrestling chat. Fuck's sake. Okay, so first of all, let's go to let's hear from Dom, because we haven't heard from you from so long.
All right, cool. Well, I had two choices coming into this. One of which I could have done a James Belkiff and tried to game you personally to manipulate you, but instead I played it properly and went with what I actually want, which is Deathloop.
Okay.
It was a PlayStation exclusive when it launched, despite Bethesda being owned by Microsoft at that point. It didn't sell particularly well, but to be honest, I could have chosen any of Arcane's games, because they make games that games journos like, but everyone else seems to hate. Or at least not enjoy and not sell.
That's the wrong podcast topic. We've had this.
I mean, it's treading similar ground, right? Not to like piss on our own concept here. But games over commercial flop, like all the Arcane stuff. I was going to go for Dishonored, but Deathloop was newer, fresher, and it had that kind of 60s psychedelic vibe, which I really, really enjoyed. And also, I like the systems more. The gunplay is better than all the sort of like enforced melee stuff you get in the Dishonored games. So. Yeah, I just really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really cool concept. I thought it was Arcane really demonstrating that they could do something a bit different that isn't in that kind of like really high sci-fi setting like Prey, or in that really kind of like funky fantasy steampunk-esque thing that they had Dishonored in. So yeah, I think it was just it's strong. The voice acting and the sort of like time loop narrative they've got in there. I think a lot of fiction does time travel really, really fucking badly. And I think Deathloop does it in a really interesting way that leans into it being a video game, that leans into it being interactive, that leans into the idea that you keep on dying and keep on coming back. It's like a mechanic we have in games a lot that is justified and put quite well. So, yeah, Deathloop. Everyone should play it. It's on Game Pass. Everyone should play it. Play it.
It is good. I was one of those people that gave that 5 out of 5. It is good.
Yeah. Isn't it on PS Plus as well? Isn't it like it's? Like,
it was. I don't know if it
was for a while.
I don't know.
I feel like there's no I mean, I've got it on two machines. When I haven't. Do you know what? I actually find Deathloop really intimidating. That's my problem with it. Like, I really like the style of it, and I feel it feels really good to play. The shooting is really nice, and I like the style of it and everything else. But I've played it a few times, and I haven't even got to the point where you like properly start looping and doing all the weird timey-wimey stuff, because I'm intimidated by it, and I should probably just plow through and not let that intimidate me, right?
I mean, that's Arcane for you, right? Every single game Arcane's ever made is just it looks so impenetrable. It's just this like massive massive wall, this massive palisade of just mechanics and stuff, and it's so hard to overcome and penetrate. But once you do,
I enjoy also that it's the same series as Dishonored, technically.
Yeah, it's in the same universe, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Same universe, not series, I guess. But I like it when devs do that, when they make a different thing.
Yeah.
But still make it part of another piece. It is good.
All the sci-fi stuff in it as well, all that kind of lore and all that weird sci-fi stuff. It's like, it feels so disconnected from what Dishonored is and was. So if you're trying to pull those threads together, and if you go in there, it's very, very subtle, the kind of connections between it, but it's there, and you can kind of see how that all works and kind of falls in together. I love Arcane and what they do. I think they're a very underrated niche and possibly slightly.
I don't think they're underrated. They're perfectly rated. They're just their games have some reason don't have the mass appeal that I guess the quality
They're
of them
underselling, but they're not
suggests.
underrated because people do rate, like, the way people talk about Arcane, it's with that sort of reverence that's reserved for really, really top tier studios, but they have always struggled to
I think it's because
sell.
yeah. I think it is because they're intimidating.
Ironically, it's like Microsoft bought Bethesda for Elder Scrolls and Fallout, right? But ironically, one of the best fits for them is Arcane because the sort of games they make are probably almost best off being in a subscription where you don't have to commit to paying 60 or 70 quid for it.
100%, yeah, it's really good. Them and Obsidian, I would say. I think Obsidian are probably in the same boat where they make like lots of the most brilliant stuff and probably push the envelope in ways that other studios don't, but they don't have the mass appeal of a Bethesda or a BioWare or anything like that. They've never had a real hit like that, have they?
Exactly. So you look at like the last few years or the coming year on Xbox, and you have Deathloop, Ghostwire Tokyo, and Pentiment all coming out because things that probably wouldn't. I think Ghostwire as well didn't sell particularly well on PlayStation. So when it comes eventually to Game Pass, this new era of like Xbox supported Game Pass games that may not commercially be the most successful, but definitely have their appeal. It's quite a good time to
Ghostwire Tokyo is also a wonderful Game Pass game. Yeah, it's brilliant. Because Ghostwire Tokyo was such great digital tourism.
Podcast? What's going on?
We're actually talking about video games now.
No,
sorry, Tom.
This is not allowed. I want to get back on the topic. Tom. The topic being that Deathloop is the game we've chosen here, right?
Every single podcast I'm on, every time people start talking earnestly about video games, someone goes, "Oh, what are we doing?"
But Deathloop. The problem I have with Deathloop is that I find it looks boring. It just looks boring.
What are you on about?
All of their games, they look boring. I think that's the problem.
It doesn't look boring. It looks like you're an assassin on the Isle of Man.
I don't think. I mean, their games look nice, but they also look a bit boring. You look at them compared to like other AAA stuff, and because the art style is it's distinctive, but it doesn't have the kind of wow of big AAA, which I think probably does hurt them a little bit.
I actually don't understand where you're coming from there.
Just that they don't look
all
whiz
that
bang.
whaling stuff in the Dishonored games is like the steampunk whale-based economy is incredible.
Yeah, it's
boring. I do realize I just said the phrase whale-based economy, so yeah, you're probably right.
Even about mobile games,
all right. Okay, let's move on to. I'm very curious because Alex didn't tell me his ahead of time, so I'm very curious to find out what it is. Have you picked something? Are you picking something right now?
No, I've picked something, but it's sort of like one of those things. It's the opposite of Bill Cliff. It's a game I've spoken about before. It's a game I know you aren't necessarily fond of, so I'm making a rod for my own back. But for me, you talk about this, and there's only really. So I almost came into this, and you're going to know where I'm going straight away as soon as these words leave my mouth. But I almost went into this wanting to be cheeky, and I sort of am being cheeky at the same time because I want to put this forward out there and say this category is made for the Dreamcast, where it was home. The console was brilliant and underrated and ahead of its time. Like so much of what the Dreamcast was doing was then later done by the Xbox. It was just you know, but they were just screwed from the start. You know, they had that falling out with EA and Sega never got along. Have you ever wondered why EA games on the Mega Drive / Genesis came in weird shaped carts? That was because EA always refused to pay the licensing fee to actually have official Sega carts, and they reverse engineered the machine to be able to put their own carts in, which I think these days there would be a legal challenge over that, but back then it's a bit more Wild Westy.
It was the Wild West back then, wasn't it?
So EA and Sega never really got along, and so EA pulled out of the Dreamcast before it even released, so they never had any of the sports games, and lots of things happened to really, really hurt Sega's chances. And the Saturn was a problem as well, right? You know, that if you're coming off the back of something bad, you've got to work extra hard to right it, but it can happen. Look at the Switch. But anyway, so when I think of this, I think of the Dreamcast, and then obviously the flagship of this is, of course, Shenmue. That is you know, it is, at the time, it was the most expensive game ever made. It was an incredible technological masterpiece. It had started life as a Saturn game and grown into this next gen title. There's a lot. I realise it's an acquired taste, but there's a lot about Shenmue that I think is wonderful. There's a lot about the sort of the joy it takes in the mundane that I think then sort of filters down into things like Persona and things like even down to things like Elder Scrolls and like later Elder Scrolls games and Witcher games. I think Shenmue is the first thing to sort of do that. You go the way in which you go through that world. I think, you know, the way in which it uses the calendar. Influence the later Persona games, the way they use the calendar. Like, its influence is enormous. Its influence over things like facial animation and stuff like that. And if you look back at it, it was, you know, I was looking it up this morning, and you look at how it scored, and it was like an A+, which is the high score they did on 1UP, a 9 from Eurogamer back when they didn't think scores were beneath them. You know, really praised in Edge, 5 stars from Next Generation, 4.5 stars from Game Trailers, IGN 9.7, and then a litany of 10s from places like Dreamcast Magazine and things like that. But the point, there were a few weird outliers. Like Game Informer gave it a 6, so there were some people who just did not get on with it. But on the whole, its average score, you know, in the Metacritic didn't exist then, but in the modern Metacritic parlance, this would have been a 90-something. You know, it would have been up there with your Breath of the Wilds and things like that. So it was this cultural, this cultural beloved darling critically, and I think among the audience. But the combination of the sheer amount that it cost and the Dreamcast install base. So it went on to sell about 1.2 million copies, which is pretty decent, but it was just nowhere near. You know, it was the sort of game where it wasn't like, we are disappointed. It was the sort of game where Sega executives in finance calls outright called it a commercial failure. And it as a commercial failure probably did also have moved the needle a little bit on moving Sega that little bit closer towards the brink that they then later toppled off. But I just look at it and I'm just like, I understand that some people, the sort of weird day-to-day tone of the game and the lackadaisical way it just sort of flows and things like that, it's absolutely not for everyone. The weird English voice acting situation where it's all the English voiceover is sort of terrible because Yu Suzuki insisted on all the voice acting being recorded in Japan, and in those days they definitely weren't going to fly people over to Japan, so they just cast whatever English-speaking people they could find who lived, you know, within a commutable distance to Sega's office. And famously, right, the main guy who plays Ryo, a huge element of him being cast was that Suzuki felt he looked a bit like Ryo, even though the performance wasn't that good. And so things like that put people off. But I still think it's one of the most important games ever made, really. And I think it's one of the most, when you look at video games in their modern form now, there's like a handful of games along that path that I think were really demonstrative and really formative for how 3D action games and 3D exploration and 3D world spaces would be built in the future. And Shenmue sits alongside stuff like Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 and GoldenEye, and, you know, you go a little later, I think it sits alongside stuff like Halo and things like that. But the one difference it has from all those other games is that it was a complete and total flop and lost an enormous amount of money. And so it just feels like an absolutely perfect fit for this category. It is, I'm very aware and acquired taste, and I know that you don't particularly like it, Jim. I have a lot of time for it.
I've got something to say about it quickly.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is this the most boring games of all time podcast? Or...
But this is what I mean. It's an acquired taste, but I don't think Shenmue is boring. Like, I think the second one's better.
Have I gone off on one about Shenmue in the past?
I think so. I feel like that's the case, because I remember when I was picking, and this is one of those topics where it wasn't really a pick. straight away I zeroed in on this, and I remember having a second thought and thinking, probably won't win because I don't think Jim likes Shenmue, but maybe I. But for me, that's the thing, Tom. For me, it's not boring because the deliberate mundane element of that day to day is sort of beautiful. But then again, I am one of those people that was that affected by this game that, and I only know.
You bought the jacket. That's what you're going to say, didn't you?
No, I know the story.
No, but I have been to something. I know one other person who's done it, Andy Kelly. But when I was in Japan once, I went to Yokosuka because I wanted to, and walked the streets that are depicted in that game, and was blown away by how, even though the game's set in the 80s, so we were 30 plus years removed, how I actually recognised some of those streets, and some of the shops that had clearly been there for that entire period, where they'd gone and taken their reference photos and were like, right, this is an American-style jacket shop with a big yellow sign, and you walk down the street and you go, that's the military apparel store for Shenmue. It isn't a military apparel store; it's something slightly different, but that is the same facade and the same color scheme and all the rest, and so. And that's where I think Shenmue matters. It's even to this day, the world it builds and what it depicts is so impressive, even by modern standards. And so that's where you look at it and you look at the legacy of this game. But I just think it's a great game, and it was a huge commercial flop. It lost millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. And as a bonus, it flopped despite being the most expensive game of all time at the time of its release, which is even more embarrassing. And I do wonder, the last thing I'll say is, I feel mostly the flop, the game was definitely an acquired taste, but lots of games that are an acquired taste find an audience. I think the bigger problem was that it was on the Dreamcast, and I think had that game, and then by the time it came out, by the time the second one came to Xbox, it was sort of too late. But I think had that game launched on PS2, we'd be looking at it and going, this is one of the most influential games of all time, and Yu Suzuki probably would have got to make his 7-part saga, or however many bloody parts it was supposed to be. Shenmue.
I think so. I've played. I didn't play Shenmue back in the day, but I played the remasters for a bit when they came out, mostly out of curiosity. And I find them. So you can see. I mean, obviously from Shenmue you directly get Yakuza, right? And it's got that that wonderful. We always talk about the sense of place that a lot of these types of games have, and like you say, the mundanity of the day-to-day stuff that you do, the life sim stuff is really important. I think it is part of that mix that you get. How do you get to, Skyrim, for example? You start off with Elite in the 80s, and it introduces the concept of an open world / galaxy where you can go anywhere and do anything within the systems of the game. And then you get along the way you get stuff like Shenmue, which really takes that and grounds it somewhere familiar.
Well, even though it's a different country and stuff, I genuinely don't think you get to Radiant AI, the famed Oblivion, Skyrim, Fallout AI engine and all the craziness that causes, where all the NPCs have their day-to-day schedules and all that sort of stuff. I genuinely think you don't get to that without Shenmue, because Shenmue had that just in a less evolved form, but people had places they had to go, places they had to be, had to do things at certain times of day, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it was more sophisticated than Morrowind was. Morrowind came out years later. So yeah, that's a pretty good pick. I think I find Shenmue baffling and impenetrable, but I don't dislike it. I
couldn't get through most of the doors in his house. I was just I'm lost in this maze. And that was it.
Yeah. I haven't been in many Japanese buildings, but their hotels are a bit like that.
It is hard to believe. I hadn't even twigged that, but you just said it. But it is hard to believe that game came out 2 years before Morrowind. That is sort of wild to me. Yeah. And when people say Yakuza as well, I want to say Yakuza is sort of a descendant of Shenmue, but the thing I'd say is I think Yakuza is more like Shenmue had a love child with Streets of Rage. So it sort of gets its world view and its world building and stuff from Shenmue and the sense of place it has and stuff, but it gets the sort of smash and grab and intensity from those Sega beat 'em ups. I think it's sort of a combination of those two. Whereas obviously in Shenmue it's got that martial arts thing, but like Shenmue, you might choose to spend your afternoon in a local park just practicing a move over and over again in order to be able to use it in the fights later. And obviously Yakuza doesn't have that sort of cadence.
Yakuza is like one of the greatest games of all time because it's got like 50% of it is the brilliantly kind of modern like life sim stuff where it does like really it simulates city life in a way that's really intricate and really compelling, but you also get to walk from left to right battering people, which I think is also just as important. All right, Tom.
All right, I've been googling boring games just to try and get a third choice that fits, because I don't want to disappoint the listeners. This has been pretty dire so far, hasn't it?
This is you're so mean, Tom. Honestly,
I mean, I couldn't think of two games I couldn't like just have no interest in whatsoever. So my choice, actually, I mean, Alex is talking about how Shenmue sort of was bad for Sega. My game actually made the whole studio close. It bombed that hard. So it's a very good game, one of the best racing games of all time. And it's so if we go back to sort of late what I'm trying to think of, like the period, it was like just to the end, like 2000, I don't know when it was, 2009, something like that. Activision bought Bizarre Creations, which was a game studio that specialized in doing mostly racing games. They did do other stuff that was good as well. But off the back of making PGR games for Microsoft, they had this game called Blur, which was developed for Activision, and it was billed as like, it's got proper cars in it, but also power-ups and stuff. So it looked on the face of it a bit like a Mercedes firing a blue shell, whatever. It didn't really feel like that when you played it, but it looked a bit like it was a bit of an odd mashup. But I think what you didn't really get from the marketing was that it was actually a very good arcade racer in terms of the way it felt to play. It had all the kind of like the nuance that like the PGR games had, really, in terms of the driving model and everything else. It was really good fun just to race around in. I think if anything, the power-ups hurt it in that it made it seem like a bit of a gimmicky game, and in fact it was just a really good arcade racer. And the problem was that at the time, and it was billed as some kind of like driving game war, because you had this and you had Split Second, which was, I think, a much far inferior game, but it looked flashier for sure. I know, Alex, what you're going to say, but it was not as good. And then there was some like Modern Nation Racers and some other stuff that was around at the same time, and it was like, all these racing games, how can they all compete together? Well, they clearly couldn't, or they were never going to, because there wasn't a market for them. But Blur sold very badly. Like, I don't know what the projections were, but I think it did like, I don't know, $500,000 or something. Like, very bad for a game that was. This is from like Activision's big studio. They bought Bizarre. This was like the first thing. Well, was it the first thing from them? I can't remember when the Bond, who did Bond, and when that happened, but it was like the first big racing game anyway from them since the acquisition.
I want to say this was after Bloodstone, but I think they did. Oh no, they were the same. Well, they were the same year, so they were basically on top of each other.
Right. But it was like, this was the first big racing game. They had high hopes for it. Obviously, it didn't do very well at all, which I think partly down to the way it was marketed. The concept itself was possibly a little bit too much for some people just to get their head around. Like, do you want to be driving around licensed cars while firing off Proton Blast, wherever it was. I don't know. But I think if you looked away from that, it was really good, like arcade racer with this kind of like flashy racing that you would have, like, if you play the PGR games, you would appreciate. But it just really did very badly. They closed the studio the following year, probably less than a year after the game released. And that was it. They were making a sequel, which had you like driving on the side of buildings and stuff, looked really cool. That never actually happened. And then we just lost a studio that was responsible for some really good games. So Blur, for me, I when I had a 360 hooked up, I played it quite a lot. Just go back, give it a little go. And then it's just like the whole studio's gone because this game bombed. And compared to the other games we're talking about, this looks like a fun video game. Like, it's got colour.
Definitely, it's got
got a really good soundtrack. It doesn't have tedious doors in it. You're not just simulating your own life. I mean, it's a better game as a gamey game than anything else we talked about.
It's
I
like
think
a
it was
top of the line.
a miscalculation there, right? I think it was people liked the fun of PGR. Like some of my fondest ever online memories are like when you used to do cat and mouse in PGR, right, where you would have minis and Lamborghinis or whatever, and you would technically team up. It wasn't a real mode, but the people with the faster cars would try and push the people with the smaller cars around the track as quickly as they could. And PGR, you made your own fun in crazy ways like that, but I always felt it was a miscalculation to sort of do this. Like the Cliff Notes pitch, right, was it's Mario Kart but with real cars. Power-ups and all that sort of stuff. And I think a lot of people who would buy PGR, even though it's a racing game with silly things in it, were like, well, that's too silly for me. And, you know, don't forget, there was that and Split Second, but Split Second bombed as well. So it wasn't like it wasn't like this particularly. I don't know. It was. I don't know if people just weren't. There wasn't space in the market at the time. Obviously, that was when Need for Speed was really big. But
it
also,
is mad how they're like the Armageddon Deep Impact versions of each other in a way.
And I don't know if this. Killed Bizarre in the sense that Bond came out 6 months later, and maybe it was a combination of the two. And Activision just sort of sucked back then. Still do, in terms of the way they treated studios and stuff. But yeah, my opinion is my argument against Tom is, I think it's good. I just don't think it's that good, and I think that was almost the problem. Is that it just wasn't as good as PGR, and people knew that. And so it
wasn't as good as PGR because of what we talked about. Like I think had it been another pure city racer with all the like, they had a good style to it. It looked great as a game.
Couldn't even go to Edinburgh in it. I mean,
but it didn't have the same appeal as PGR because, like you said, like, do I want to have the serious looking but fun racer and then add on top a load of neon coloured power ups? Probably not. I got most of my enjoyment from just ignoring the power-ups and doing like the challenges and stuff. So,
but this is what I mean. So you got most of your enjoyment by ignoring a core part of the game.
Yeah.
You want to know a better Bizarre Creations game that also bombed?
The one where you run through stuff. What's it called? The Club. Yeah, I like the Club. That's
it was
a good one.
first-person shooter, and they basically applied the Project Gotham Racing kudos system to a shooter. And ironically, the best mechanic from the Club later crops up in 50 Cent Blood on the Sand, where they had that same
every
kudos.
episode of this show leads to 50 Cent Blood on the Sand at some point.
That is the ultimate best game.
Yeah.
But it was only a year.
Nobody's ever picked it for anything, but it's like the shadow looms large.
It was only a year later, but it had the same system where you comboed and you got your points up, and Blood on the Sand had a wonderful twist of one of the ways you could keep your combo up in between enemies was by pressing the dedicated swear button, where 50 or his comrades would call the person they just killed a slur, and that would keep your combo going.
Press
Very
X
good
to
game.
slur.
Very good game.
I mean, was that a commercial flop? Would that have been a good choice here?
I don't know actually. Made in Birmingham as well, so that is it's got everything going for it. Truly.
Brilliant. All right, I'm going to play that jingle now that says I have to pick something.
podcast.
I think it's quite funny, Tom, that you complained about the other two being boring when the pitch for the game you picked was essentially what if we did Mario Kart but with a Ford Mondeo.
I didn't pitch it. I didn't make this game.
And I do like that.
That's still more exciting than what is it like? Walking around. I'm going to sit under a tree. I'm going to open the door. I'm going to press a machine and get a little toy out of it.
It's not about being exciting, is it? It's about being fulfilled on a spiritual and emotional level.
I don't even know what you do in Deathloop. I can't be bothered to even read a single thing about it.
Kick guys off cliffs. Travel through time to a banging 60s psych rock soundtrack. There's nothing not to like.
Yeah, it's pretty good, Tom. So, you know what, though? I do like Blur a lot. And Blur and Left 4 Dead are the only two games that I ever two multiplayer games that I ever properly got into. I don't really bother with multiplayer because, like, I'm, like, 100% worse at everything than everyone else is in terms of video games, right? So I've never really bothered with it. I just get killed every 3 seconds and quit. But like, I really enjoyed Blur. I wasn't too bad at it. I mean, I wouldn't win that often, but I would win every now and then, and that was enough to keep me going. And I thought it was I thought that fusion of Mario Kart power-ups and actual proper motorsport was actually pretty exciting. And I thought it was a much better proposition than its direct rival, which was what if Michael Bay made a racing game? What if Michael Bay fucked off? I mean, he ruined Transformers and everything else he's touched, so why do we want to let him touch anything else, even conceptually? Deathloop, again, like I said before, I find it quite intimidating, but I do love the style of it. And, you know, I find Arcane baffling, because they've made a lot of stuff, and has it all kind of flopped or just not been? Have they ever had like a proper big hit?
I think they found their niche right.
I don't think any of it has like hard flopped, but I think it's fair to say that if they weren't owned by Bethesda, which, you know, was a private capital company that didn't have to publish financial results, didn't have shareholders to answer to, and now is sort of absorbed into the greater Microsoft structure, I wonder if Arcane would have got to have continued making the sorts of games that it made, or if they would have been told, right, okay, you've tried this 2 or 3 times now and it's not really gone big, so time to do something else. I don't think that would have happened anywhere other than Bethesda, basically, because Bethesda had that. I remember when Elder Scrolls Online launched, it was really difficult to tell if that game was actually successful or not, because like the word of mouth sort of suggested it might have been a not very successful MMO, but there was no real way to tell because they've got no financial results, so they don't have to release anything.
Something that sticks with me about Arcane is that when I was at GDC a couple of years ago, someone from Sony was talking to me, and they said that Arcane make games for game developers, and I think that's like a really good way of putting it. It feels like all these systems and this kind of like, it sells really well to people that give a shit about how these things work together and all these tiny moving parts, the clockwork of game design, But then maybe the average consumer is like Tom says, that's boring. That's not something that necessarily appeals to me. That's
interesting. It's like Norm Macdonald being like the comedian's comedian, and like, you know, you watch that guy work, and it's just like there's not much going on there for anyone who isn't really looking for it. But I guess
I'm the people's critic. And I can see what people like, and they don't like Arcane games.
All right, look, I have to right, Shenmue, right? I'm almost, and no disrespect to Alex, but I'm almost loath to do this because, Alex, you win so often.
I haven't won much lately, not at all.
Only because you haven't been on. Fucking Bill Cliff's been on, soaking up all the wins when Donaldson's been away. But no, I do think you have the strongest argument for Shenmue, actually, considering if you just look at the scale of the flop and compare that to the scale of the influence it's had on games after that point, it's almost inconceivable from when you look at it from this end. It's almost inconceivable that Shenmue was such a massive, dismal failure. I mean, it contributed very directly to Sega exiting the console business altogether, didn't it?
Yes and no. It was really expensive, but almost Sega knowing that their back was against the wall was almost why they spent all the money at the same time. So it's sort of those things are definitely intertwined.
Do you know how many Dreamcasts were sold? Because I'm just wondering what the attachment rate is to like Dreamcast per
when I was doing
copies
my
of Shenmue.
research. When I was doing my research for this, I noticed there was a quote from Peter Moore that basically said that
Peter Moore.
he was the Sega boss then, right? And it basically said that the attachment for Shenmue at the time it released was really good, but it just the install base basically meant it was going to be impossible for Shenmue to actually make its money back. And looking at it now, so the Dreamcast did. Wikipedia's got it at 9.1 million.
Okay.
So, you know...
Can you imagine looking at that, the financials of that, and being like, well, we need basically everyone who's bought a Dreamcast to also buy this game, otherwise we're fucked.
There was a video game released relatively, like, you know, in recent memory where it was a PlayStation 5 exclusive where I don't know how the situation changed down the line, but early on in the PlayStation 5's life, people working on that game were shitting themselves because of all the COVID supply problems. And someone said to me legitimately, they were like, if Sony doesn't sort out, you know, if Sony distribution, whatever, doesn't sort out the problems with the PS5 install base, we might have to sell this game to like 70% of PS5 owners to make our money back. But I think Sony then actually did get all that sorted out in quite a big way. And, you know, you can walk into a shop now and buy a PS5.
We're actually properly seeing like next gen taking off now because people can actually like the
you can walk into a shop and buy a PS5.
It's incredible. It's incredible. I mean, like, what a world, right? Okay, all right. Yeah, we're going to leave it there. Tom looks absolutely furious with me, as he always does at this point in proceedings.
You know, at the start of this podcast, I said I had a game I had in mind that I could game the system if I wanted to. That game was Sleeping Dogs. Would that have had me win?
Yeah, you would have won with that.
You know the thing about Sleeping Dogs, though? I think it was quite successful on its own merits and on its budget and on its time and stuff like that. They just chose not to make another one for whatever reason.
It's the kind of the warped kind of lens of Square Enix accounting, isn't it?
Isn't every Western game a flop? Every game doesn't do as well as they want it to do, right?
Every Western game was a disappointment to them. Even when Tomb Raider sold 13 million copies and was the highest selling Tomb Raider game in history.
Our projections were for it to sell 4 billion copies, and no, it's like ridiculous.
Unfortunately, that was the one I was quite tempted to sort of go outside. I was quite tempted to go outside the remit and say not a game and say Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within.
Wow!
Which obviously at the time biggest box office bomb of all time.
That was another boring piece of shit, wasn't it?
That film I actually think is okay. The other Final Fantasy films are not good.
I got a soft spot for having children.
It's shite.
It's shite, but it's good shite. It's like eating like nothing but a whole loaf of white bread.
38 minutes, the timer says. 38 minutes.
I'm just enjoying watching you absolutely stew in the little webcam window, just like...
I've got stuff to do, and this is just like... I'm sure I said to you, let's do this quite quickly, as we've all got lots on.
Yeah.
Let's make this quick, as everyone has loads to do, I said.
I'm going to lose anyway. Let's get it over with. All right, okay. Well, look, so the best game that completely flopped is and will always remain Shenmue. I don't think any game will flop on quite the same scale as Shenmue did. But while also having possibly such a long tail of affection as well, it's quite a remarkable thing. Never to be repeated.
Didn't the new one super flop as well? 3, didn't it just come out and just
the new one was crap as well?
No one cared. It's like. Not surprised.
Nobody cared apart from...
Because it looks like it was made 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's like we're making this sequel as if we were making it at the time. All right, okay. Well, thank you very much for listening. Please, as always, leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. We really do appreciate it. And, you know, and if you want to give some rival podcasts a 2-star review on our behalf, we're not going to ask you to. But, you know, if you did, it would be cool. All right. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Like I said, you will find out in this here podcast.
if you enjoyed the show, please give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. It really helps us get the word out. We're not just a podcast, of course. If you'd like to hear more from the team, then check out VG247.com for our fantastic news coverage, features, reviews, and game guides. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Transport links are pretty great here in Scotland. Your cars and aeroplanes, therefore, knobs, man.
I know this is the same one as last week, but one of the choices this week was Deathloop. So just imagine we've looped.
Across the Firth of Tay, there's only one way, ScotRail. Every minute something's taking ScotRail. No curtain rails or humpback wheels, no ScotRail. Up, Glasgow Central, and Bekeithing, Bathgate, Bethel. What do you just jump onto a ScotRail? Your tramlets, get yourself on ScotRail. This daft joke won't travel well, but ScotRail. Sam, wake up.